So, Barry, thanks for joining me here today. The first and spending some time with us. So, the first question I have for you is sort of the first question I have for most people is how did you get into adult ed in the first place? Right? Nobody, when they're in high school, is like, oh, I want to be an adult educator. I want to be a fireman. I want to be a cowboy. Nobody says like I want to be an adult educator. So, how'd you end up in the field?
I was teaching history in high school and I was coaching football and I had at the $100 extra for coaching football. And this principal called me in and said, the guy who's running the night school can't do it anymore. Do you want to run the night school? It's $100 extra.
So you switched from football to the night school.
That's right.
So, and in retrospect, was that a good career move, or did you miss your place in Canton that you could have?
Is that amazing?
Yeah. So what was the night school like then? So what decade are we talking?
1961, 62.
All right.
And it was a pretty big night school. A lot of secretarial classes, typing, shorthand, steno.
Uh-huh.
There was also sewing and auto mechanics. Uh, Quite a variety of things. Um, in 62, amazing, somebody on the Board of Education got passed in the budget money for two basic skills teachers. So that was the beginning of basic skills. And
Hmm.
when the federal money came in, we had to maintain that effort.
Hmm. So when you first started, the people in the night school had completed their own high school and they were coming back for vocational work, or some of those
Yes,
folks hadn't finished high school. No, it's folks that had finished high school.
yes, most of them had finished high school and were back. And there were a lot of recreational kind of things.
Okay.
Yeah, but with that local board money, I started a GED class and two ABE classes.
All right. And how long did they exist in parallel? I mean, certainly nowadays, most adults don't think about, most adults with a high school diploma don't necessarily think about going to like a nighttime school anymore.
Well, it was interesting. One of the chores that a director had in those days was to recruit. I went to the churches. I went to different organizations. I
Hmm.
spoke at some different organizations so that I got the word out there that people who had not completed high school could come and talk to me and
Hmm.
get into a class.
How long did it take to transition into mostly a school for folks who are coming back to get the GED or to complete their education?
And according to their level, some of them were pretty close and a lot of them were not. And some of them weren't there to complete. I remember one of my favorite quotes was an older woman came and she said, I want to be able to do my own checkbook. My son's
Mhm.
doing my own checkbook, and I want to do my checkbook.
Yeah, yeah.
She
So,
wasn't interested.
so how many other places in the state were offering GEDs at that time?
Uh, in my county, one other one.
Uh-huh.
But remember, in the big cities, in Camden, Newark, Patterson, Jersey City, the bigger cities, were running adult high schools.
Hmm.
And they were getting state aid, just like regular state aid for students
Uh-huh.
in that formula. And students had to complete U.S. history and English, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And those were because they were adult high schools, they were 5 day a week programs, right? It was just like a regular high school, but it took place at night.
Yes, yes.
So when do you think the turning point was away from those adult high schools? I mean, because that was a big part of the New Jersey state system for a long time.
Yeah, I was trying to remember that. I can remember the commissioner that came in. I had left the department in '85, and I believe it was shortly after that in the '90s that the department did a intricate, complete mission study and
Hmm.
um, honed in completely on K-12.
Uh-huh. And so then the
And
adults school got
that's
pushed
when
aside.
the discussion between the commissioners to move the money over to labor occurred in that time. But the funding for the adult high school, and there were five other sources of state aid that we got passed through the legislature in the '70s.
Hmm.
There was a basic skills program, there was a GED funded program, and the big funding, there was two-thirds of the salaries of an adult director up to $12,000. At that time, in the late '60s, there were like three or four in the state.
Hmm.
Within 10 years, there were 50.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And of course, that's what really drove the growth of adult education.
So the high schools were fully funded and robust until the shift over to labor.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it
Yeah,
was a policy decision rather than sort of a fiscal necessity to do that.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
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 When did you move into administration? So you quit football, you take this evening job, and then that evening job changes from being sort of vocational extension education to, you know, GED program, high school completion types of programs. When did you start to kind of move up the ladder into administration?
Well, the federal money came in '64. That's the Economic Opportunity Act.
Right.
Oh no. And at that time, a whole lot of other funding started to come in. So I was asked to take a new position of federal and state funding and the adult ed job. And I came out of the classroom and became a full time administrator. And I think that was about 65, 66 in
All
there.
right. What was that transition like for you? Do you remember going from the classroom to the office?
Ah, it was unbelievably different. I mean, and I love teaching. I love the classroom, and but I just had two new children born, and and I was making my teaching salary was 3,400 a year.
Yeah.
So I jumped from 3,400 to 8,500 or something like that.
Yeah. That's pretty significant. That's a pretty significant jump. So when you moved into administration, what were some of the initial goals you set for yourself? Sort of looking at the state, looking at the field. What did you want to get done when you took that position?
Well, I guess just to bring in as many programs as I could to help the community. And this uh, Title One came in, Title Two came in, Title Three came in, the whole litany of funded programs.
Hmm.
And and at that time, the forerunner of New Jersey All was AEA and J. And in the late '60s, massive advocacy effort. I remember we delivered, with the help of some local directors, 18 busloads of students
Wow.
to State Street. They had to move the Appropriations Committee meeting from the State House down to the museum auditorium. And some of those students were ready to speak up.
Hmm.
We came out of that the next year with funding, state funding
Hmm.
for ABGD, um, and the two-thirds
Hmm.
reimbursement for director's salary. And that's the guy who really engineered all that was Clyde Weinhold.
Hmm.
What a visionary he was.
Hmm.
And he also established the four college resource centers:
Hmm.
Clare, Glassboro, Kane, Trenton,
Hmm.
and had a professional adult educator
Hmm.
with doctorate degrees at those centers that work with local programs.
Hmm.
It was phenomenal.
Where was
Just
he housed? Where was his like where was he working?
he was recruited by the commissioner in the late 60s, I believe, to come to the Department of Education
Uh-huh.
with that new aid coming in and so forth. And he created a bureau at the Department of Education, and he's the one who hired me
Uh-huh.
in 70.
Well, then of course you would speak highly of him because he's the one that hired you.
Well, but he was very sharp guy, I'll tell
Yeah.
you.
Well, he hired you, right? So he was sharp enough to hire you. So what do you, looking back on your time as an administrator, what would you say are some of the sort of the highlights or the peaks of what you think you accomplished?
Well, in my day when I became state director, I must have spoken at, I can't imagine, 50, 70, 80 graduations.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I never walked out of a place feeling so good.
Yeah.
And hearing those students talk about what they had achieved and what they were going to do now with their lives, and those speeches blew me away. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, I guess that most of all.
All right. And what do you think was the biggest hurdle that you had to address or that you had to kind of try to overcome while you were in that position?
Uh, I guess I guess the key to those college resource centers was that there were so few adult educators, and
Mhm.
and bringing people up to snuff to run programs and to teach programs was probably and it would have been absolutely impossible without those college resource centers.
Mhm. So sort of creating and maintaining a viable pipeline of people coming in, to teach and be part of the field. Um, have you seen the demographics of people involved in the field change over your decades? Like who was working in schools when in the 60s versus who's working in schools now? Same population, different population?
Absolutely. Well, I believe the census figures back in those days were half of the adults in New Jersey didn't have a high school diploma. And obviously that has drastically changed.
Yeah.
And of course, the other giant change in the 80s and 90s and into 2000 was the rise of the community college and the rise of the county vocational schools,
Mm-hmm.
and which really put a lot of most of the school-based programs out of business.
Mm-hmm. How do you look upon that development? Good, bad, mixed bag?
Well, my background in community education of involving people, the community, in efforts like adult education was so important to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think a little of that got lost in the county college, county vocational movement.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, they had probably better prepared staff and
Mm-hmm.
more professional programming. But we prided ourselves on advisory committees. We had an advisory committee for this and an advisory committee for that, and we were really trying to involve the community in every aspect of it.
Right. That's the ongoing tension in the field, right? The professionalization brings with it additional resources, and potentially, uh, teaching practices that are sort of up to date. The downside is sometimes losing the connection to the community that you started to work for in the first place, right? So I don't know that we've got if we're ever going to have an easy answer to that, right? I mean, I think that's a real tension that's going to remain. So then how long have you been involved in the New Jersey Association for Lifelong Learning? Ever since it was started?
Uh, I remember the director from Fairlawn, Dave Kimmel, had a super program in about 64, 65, after the federal money came out and things were booming. He called me, said,
Uh-huh.
I'm the new president. Would you get involved? And here's what we're doing, and here's our next meeting, and so forth. So that's how I got involved with AEA&J.
Uh-huh.
And I forget when that changed over. I think it was early 70s, late 70s, somewhere in there,
Hmm.
to New Jersey Hall.
And what do you feel like are some of the important lessons you've learned from being involved in NJL over the last few decades?
I always joked I never met an adult educator I didn't like. A lot of good friends,
Uh-huh.
a lot of people I looked up to.
All right. Any challenges that you think Angel needs to put front and center, looking to the future?
Well, obviously, the demographics and the mission are both changing rapidly. Um, I guess number one, we could do a better job with advocacy in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, some funding priorities should be going through the legislature. I remember in our day we testified before that appropriation committee a dozen times,
Mhm.
and we had some legislators really in with us,
Mhm.
ready to work with us.
Mhm.
Um, but it's hard for me to get a handle on it, tell you the truth.
Well, I mean, if you've got 18 busloads of students coming up on their front steps, then they have to listen to you, right? So I think that's a huge lesson, right? That like if you've got the students, if you get the community going to those meetings and making their presence felt, then they can't ignore you.
Yep. No, that was very exciting.
Yeah. So, all right. Any last words of wisdom for folks who are considering joining the field of adult education, the wild and woolly field of adult education?
It's exciting, but you got to be real and you got to keep your eye on the student.
All right. Keep your eye on the student. Words of wisdom from the eminence grease of adult education in New Jersey, Barry Semple. Thank you so much for your time today, Barry.
Thank you, Eric. Good luck. I remember when I was state director, there was this young guy that had just graduated adult education at Columbia
Mhm.
College. And he and I would meet when I was state director, or at least a couple times a month, 3 or 4 times a month, and just share ideas. And
Mhm.
I'll tell you, he really, really helped me. His name was Hal Beater.
All right. Well, preview. We'll have a video with Hal coming up soon, hopefully. So, sales pitch for Hal Beater's video. So
Yeah.
that's great to hear.